When Dr. Malcolm St. James, a renowned black surgeon, visits a small southern town, he quickly becomes the target of Sheriff Hale, a racist and corrupt lawman who abuses his authority to intimidate and control. What begins as a routine traffic stop escalates into a sinister campaign of harassment, including planted evidence and public humiliation. Malcolm's resilience is tested as he confronts a system designed to silence him. Exposing the sheriff's prejudice and systemic abuse, Malcolm's fight reveals the chilling depths of racism in America and the high cost of seeking justice in an unjust world. Jordan Reyes stood at the gates of Titan Robotics, the sprawling tech campus, shimmering in the early morning sun. Clutching his laptop bag, he took a deep breath and squared his shoulders. This was his first day as a junior engineer, a role he had fought tooth and nail to secure. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "You've worked hard for this, mijo. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." As he crossed the threshold, the buzzing energy of the office hit him. Engineers hunched over computers, sleek robots roving the halls on testing runs. It was everything Jordan had dreamed of. But his awe was short-lived. From the corner of the room, a voice pierced through the din. "Well, look who decided to join the team," drawled a man with an icy smirk. "The scholarship kid." Jordan turned to see Darren Holt, the lead project manager. Darren was tall and imposing, with a neatly trimmed beard and the kind of swagger that demanded attention. But it was his tone, not his appearance, that caught Jordan off guard. A casual blend of condescension and sarcasm, like a predator toying with its prey. "Good morning," Jordan said, extending a hand. "I'm Jordan, nice to meet you." Darren ignored the gesture, his sharp eyes scanning Jordan's jeans and scuffed sneakers. "They really are scraping the bottom of the barrel with these outreach programs," Darren muttered, half to himself, but loud enough for the nearby engineers to snicker. Jordan's face flushed, but he kept his expression calm. He'd faced this kind of attitude before. A skepticism that followed him like a shadow because of where he came from. The son of a single mother who worked 2 jobs, Jordan had grown up in a neighborhood most people at Titan Robotics wouldn't dare drive through. But he was here now, and no one could take that away from him. "I'm here because I earned it," Jordan said, his voice steady. Darren's smirk widened. "We'll see about that. Follow me, rookie." Jordan's heart pounded as he trailed Darren through the sleek, high-tech maze of the office. He caught glimpses of engineers working on cutting-edge prototypes and felt a flicker of excitement. This was the future he wanted to be part of. But Darren's dismissive tone pulled him back down. "Here you go," Darren said, stopping abruptly at a workstation shoved into a corner. "Not the best setup, but hey, it's more than you're used to, right?" Jordan swallowed the knot in his throat and forced a polite smile. "It's perfect, thanks." Darren chuckled, leaning against the desk. "Good attitude. Let's see if you can keep it when the real work starts." Jordan nodded, determined not to rise to the bait. He unpacked his laptop and got to work, ignoring the whispers and occasional glances from Darren and the other engineers. This wasn't the first time someone had underestimated him, and it wouldn't be the last. But as he typed the first lines of code, one thought kept him grounded. Let them underestimate me. They'll see soon enough. The soft chime of bells marked the entrance of a cozy diner, tucked along a quiet street in Cedartown, a small southern town that seemed stuck in a bygone era. Morning sunlight streamed through the wide windows, glinting off the chrome countertops and making the faded red leather booths appear almost vibrant. Behind the counter, a waitress scribbled orders on a pad, her polyester uniform crisp but outdated. The aroma of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air, wrapping the diner in a warm, inviting cocoon. Dr. Malcolm St. James stepped through the door and paused, his tall frame momentarily silhouetted against the morning light. Dressed in dark slacks and a tailored yet understated shirt, he radiated an air of quiet confidence. His shoes were polished, but not flashy. His watch, an antique heirloom, glinted subtly beneath the sleeve of his cuff. Everything about him spoke of refinement, yet he carried himself with the unassuming ease of someone who valued character over appearances. The diner was half empty, its patrons a mix of blue-collar workers grabbing breakfast before their shifts and retirees nursing cups of coffee. Heads turned as Malcolm entered, but not with recognition, only mild curiosity. He was an outsider, that much was clear. In a town where everyone knew everyone else, his unfamiliar face drew the occasional lingering glance. Malcolm was used to it. In fact, he preferred it. After all, how could they know that the man standing in their diner was one of the most sought-after cardiac surgeons in the country, that he'd saved countless lives in operating rooms from New York to Atlanta, that he chaired multiple philanthropic initiatives, and had personally funded medical scholarships for dozens of underprivileged students? No, they didn't know. And Malcolm had no intention of telling them. He stepped further into the diner, his movements deliberate but unhurried. The quiet scrape of his chair echoed as he slid into a booth near the window, placing a well-worn leather briefcase on the seat beside him. Pulling out his phone, he skimmed through emails, his brow furrowing slightly at the onslaught of messages. He made a mental note to respond later. For now, he needed a moment of stillness, away from hospital alarms and the constant demands of the operating room. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes but a kind smile, approached his table. "Morning, hot coffee to start?" she asked, holding up a carafe. "Yes, please," Malcolm said, his baritone voice smooth and polite. "Black, no sugar." The waitress nodded and poured, her movements practiced and efficient. As she set the cup down, she hesitated for a moment, her gaze flickering over his polished demeanor. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked, not unkindly. Malcolm smiled faintly. "Just passing through." She seemed satisfied with the answer and moved on to another table, leaving Malcolm to his thoughts. The town of Cedartown was the kind of place that time forgot. Its main street was lined with mom-and-pop stores, antique shops, and diners like this one, all remnants of a simpler time. Yet beneath its quaint exterior lay a subtle tension, unspoken, but palpable. The kind of tension Malcolm had come to recognize over the years, particularly in small southern towns where change arrived begrudgingly, if at all. As he sipped his coffee, he glanced out the window at the quiet street beyond. A police cruiser idled at the curb, its officer leaning against the hood, chatting with a local shop owner. Across the street, a group of teenagers loitered near the steps of a library, their laughter carrying faintly through the glass. To most, it would seem like an idyllic morning, but Malcolm had seen too much to take such scenes at face value. He knew the stories that didn't make the news, the ones whispered in the corridors of hospitals or shared quietly in community meetings, stories of injustice, systemic inequality, and silent struggles. The chime of the doorbells rang again, and Malcolm glanced up instinctively. A man in a worn denim jacket and scuffed boots stepped inside, his eyes scanning the diner. He was followed by another man, this one wearing a sheriff's badge pinned to his chest. The badge glinted in the light, and the sheriff's confident swagger made it clear he expected to be noticed. The sheriff's eyes swept the room, briefly landing on Malcolm. There was no recognition in his gaze, only the faintest flicker of curiosity. Malcolm returned his gaze evenly, neither challenging nor yielding. After a moment, the sheriff smirked and turned his attention to the counter, where the waitress greeted him with a cheerful, "Morning, Sheriff Hale." Malcolm's attention returned to his coffee, though he couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over the room. The sheriff's arrival had shifted the energy, subtle but undeniable. It wasn't fear, exactly, more like an unspoken awareness of who held the power in this town. Malcolm pulled a slim leather notebook from his briefcase and began jotting notes for an upcoming lecture he was scheduled to give at Emory University. He'd barely written 2 lines when the shadow of the sheriff loomed over his table. "Morning," Sheriff Hale said, his tone dripping with false geniality. "You new around here?" Malcolm looked up, meeting the sheriff's gaze without flinching. "Just visiting," he replied calmly. "Visiting, huh?" The sheriff crossed his arms, his posture casual, but his eyes probing. "We don't get many visitors. What brings you to Cedartown?" Malcolm set his pen down deliberately. "Just passing through on my way to Atlanta," he said, his voice polite but firm. The sheriff studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Atlanta, huh? Lot of folks from there heading this way lately, buying up land, opening businesses, changing things. You one of them?" Malcolm raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unwavering. "No, just stopping for coffee." The sheriff chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "Well, enjoy your coffee," he said, his tone carrying an unspoken warning. With that, he walked away, returning to the counter where his companion was already placing an order. Malcolm exhaled quietly, his grip on his pen tightening. Encounters like this were nothing new to him, but they never ceased to leave a bitter taste. He had spent decades building a life defined by excellence, a reputation that preceded him in operating rooms and boardrooms alike. Yet here, in this unassuming diner, he was just another black man in a town where his presence drew suspicion. As the sheriff settled into a booth with his companion, Malcolm tried to refocus on his notes, but his concentration was broken when the waitress approached his table again, her expression apologetic. "Sorry about him," she said in a low voice, glancing toward the sheriff. He's set in his ways." Malcolm offered a small smile, appreciating her effort, though it didn't erase the discomfort of the exchange. "It's fine," he said simply. The waitress hesitated, then added, "You let me know if you need anything, okay?" He nodded, and she returned to the counter. As she walked away, Malcolm caught a glimpse of the sheriff glancing in his direction, his expression unreadable. Outside the diner, the street had grown busier. A man in a tailored suit stepped out of a nearby shop, holding a briefcase identical to Malcolm's. A woman in a crisp dress coat walked briskly toward the bank on the corner. Cedartown might have been small, but it wasn't entirely removed from the influences of the wider world. Change was creeping in, slow but inevitable. Malcolm finished his coffee and glanced at his watch. It was time to move on. Gathering his belongings, he left a generous tip on the table and stood to leave. As he approached the counter to settle his bill, the sheriff's voice stopped him. "Leaving already?" Hale asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. "Yes," Malcolm replied, turning to face him. "Thank you for the hospitality." The sheriff's smirk returned. "Safe travels," he said, his words laced with something unspoken. Malcolm nodded and stepped outside, the cool morning air a welcome relief. He walked to his car, a sleek, black sedan parked at the curb, and slid into the driver's seat. As he pulled away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The sheriff was standing at the window, watching him leave. Malcolm's jaw tightened. He had seen this look before. The mix of suspicion and resentment, the unspoken question. Who does he think he is? As the diner faded into the distance, Malcolm's thoughts turned to the conference waiting for him in Atlanta. He had work to do, lives to save, and systemic barriers to dismantle. But the unease lingered, a reminder of the subtle, insidious challenges that even his success couldn't shield him from. Malcolm drove along the winding roads that cut through Cedartown's outskirts, the lush green of the countryside stretching for miles. The crisp morning air had given way to a muggy stillness, the kind that pressed against your skin and made you feel weighed down. Despite the peace of the surroundings, Malcolm's mind was a whirlwind. The encounter with Sheriff Hale replayed in his head. Each word heavy with unspoken accusation. Malcolm had been here before, too many times to count. The subtle smirks, the probing questions, the implications. "What are you doing here? You don't belong." He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles whitening. Moments like this always left him torn. The surgeon in him wanted to stay clinical, to dissect these encounters and analyze them for what they were, relics of a broken system, a reflection of ignorance. But the man in him, the black man who had spent a lifetime navigating these coded hostilities, wanted to rage. Instead, he focused on the road ahead. The hospital conference in Atlanta awaited him, a room full of peers who would hang on his every word as he outlined groundbreaking techniques that could save thousands of lives. "That's where my energy belongs," he told himself. Not on small-town prejudice. The quiet hum of his car's engine was interrupted by the wail of a police siren. Blue and red lights flashed in his rearview mirror, cutting through the serene landscape. Malcolm's stomach dropped. He glanced at his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. His registration was up to date. His car, a clean, well-maintained luxury sedan, had no visible issues. Still, he knew better than to question the motives of the officer pulling him over. Malcolm slowed to a stop on the side of the road. He took a deep breath, his surgeon's precision guiding his movements. Turn off the engine. Hands on the wheel. Stay calm. Stay polite. The crunch of boots on gravel grew louder as the officer approached his window. Malcolm turned his head slightly, catching a glimpse of the figure through the side mirror. It was Sheriff Hale. "Morning again?" Hale drawled, leaning down so his face was level with the open window. His aviator sunglasses reflected Malcolm's own image back at him. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." "Morning, Sheriff," Malcolm replied evenly, his hand still gripping the steering wheel. "Is there a problem?" Hale tilted his head, as if considering the question. "Well, I noticed you leaving town earlier, and I thought it'd be a good idea to check in out-of-towners. Sometimes forget our roads have speed limits." "I wasn't speeding," Malcolm said carefully, keeping his tone respectful but firm. Hale raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe not. But you've got a pretty nice car there. Mind if I see your license and registration?" Malcolm complied, moving slowly and deliberately to retrieve the documents from his glove compartment. He handed them over, watching as Hale took his time examining them. The sheriff's smirk grew wider. "Dr. Malcolm St. James," he read aloud, his tone dripping with mock surprise. "A doctor, huh? Fancy title? What brings someone like you to Cedartown?" Malcolm forced a tight smile. "Just passing through, as I mentioned earlier." Hale hummed, flipping the license over as though expecting to find something hidden on the back. Passing through must be nice to have a car like this to just pass through. The insinuation was clear. Malcolm remained silent. "You got any drugs in the car, Doc?" Hale asked suddenly, his voice casual but laced with an edge that made Malcolm's chest tighten. "No, Sheriff," Malcolm said, his calm slipping just slightly. "I don't." Hale leaned closer, his hand resting on the edge of the window. "Mind if I take a look? Just routine." The question wasn't really a question, and they both knew it. Malcolm's jaw tightened. He wanted to say no, to assert his rights, but he also knew how these situations could spiral. A black man refusing to cooperate could be seen as defiance, or worse, aggression. "Go ahead," Malcolm said evenly, stepping out of the car when instructed. He watched as Hale methodically searched the vehicle, pulling open the trunk, rifling through the glove compartment, and checking under the seats. Malcolm stood on the gravel shoulder, his shoes crunching with each shift of his weight. The sun bore down on him, and the heat was compounded by the silent stares of passing drivers. After what felt like an eternity, Hale emerged from the car, brushing non-existent dust from his hands. "All clear," he said with a shrug, as though the inconvenience he'd just caused was nothing more than a friendly misunderstanding. Malcolm met his gaze, his expression calm, but his eyes steely. "Am I free to go, Sheriff?" Hale's smirk didn't falter, but his sunglasses slipped down slightly, revealing eyes that were cold and calculating. "Sure thing. Doc, safe travels." Malcolm got back into his car without a word, his every movement measured and deliberate. As he pulled away, his heart pounded, a mix of anger, humiliation, and helplessness simmering beneath the surface. He gripped the wheel tightly, his professional demeanor cracking at the edges. He wanted to scream, to demand accountability, to call Hale out for the racist abuse of power that had just unfolded, but he knew better. He always had to know better. By the time he reached Atlanta, the morning's events still weighed heavily on him. He parked in the lot of the hospital conference center, the towering glass building, a stark contrast to Cedartown's rustic streets. As he walked through the entrance, his posture straightened, and the mask of composure returned. The lobby buzzed with activity as doctors, researchers, and medical professionals milled about, exchanging greetings and business cards. Malcolm's presence drew immediate recognition. Several colleagues approached him, their faces lighting up. "Dr. St. James, I was hoping to see you here," said Dr. Patel, a cardiologist from Houston. "I heard about your latest research. It's groundbreaking." Malcolm nodded politely, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. He fell seamlessly into the role of the esteemed surgeon, the admired peer. But even as he spoke, his thoughts lingered on Sheriff Hale's sneer, the implicit message that no amount of success could insulate him from the biases that clung to his skin like an unwelcome shadow. The conference's keynote session began, and Malcolm took his place at the front of the room. His presentation was met with rapt attention, the audience hanging on his every word as he outlined new surgical techniques and their potential impact on patient outcomes. By the time he finished, the room erupted into applause. As he stepped down from the podium, a young black medical student approached him, her eyes wide with admiration. "Dr. St. James, that was incredible," she said. "You're the reason I decided to pursue cardiology." Her words brought a genuine smile to Malcolm's face, momentarily easing the weight he carried. "Thank you," he said warmly. "If there's anything I can do to support your journey, don't hesitate to reach out." The student nodded eagerly, her enthusiasm a reminder of why Malcolm had chosen this path. But as she walked away, the dichotomy of his reality became sharper. In rooms like these, he was celebrated. Out there, on country roads and in small-town diners, he was just another black man to be scrutinized and doubted. That evening, Malcolm sat in his hotel room, staring out at the city lights. His phone buzzed with a notification, a news alert from Cedartown. Curious, he opened it. The headline read, "Sheriff Hale praised for community policing efforts." Malcolm's grip on the phone tightened as he skimmed the article, filled with glowing quotes about Hale's dedication and service. The hypocrisy was galling. The same man who had stopped and humiliated him for no reason that morning was being celebrated as a pillar of the community. For the first time in a long while, Malcolm felt something break inside him. He thought of the countless others, those without his resources, his education, or his platform, who faced far worse at the hands of men like Hale. He couldn't stay silent anymore. By the time he closed his laptop that night, Malcolm had drafted a letter to the Cedartown Gazette. It wasn't just about his experience, it was about systemic abuse of power, about unspoken biases and the cost they exacted on individuals and communities. It was time for the truth to come out. The morning after Malcolm sent the letter to the Cedartown Gazette, he felt a strange mixture of relief and trepidation. The letter had been a calculated move, penned with precision to call attention to Sheriff Hale's abuse of power, while also tying it to larger systemic issues. Malcolm knew it would ruffle feathers. What he didn't expect was how quickly the ripples would turn into waves. The letter was published online that very morning, and within hours, it had gone viral. Malcolm's words struck a chord, not just in Cedartown, but across the state. His professional title and measured tone lent credibility to his accusations, making it hard for the town to dismiss him as just another disgruntled outsider. Social media buzzed with debates about Cedartown's sheriff department, and local activists began organizing, demanding accountability. But with the outpouring of support came backlash. Malcolm's phone buzzed relentlessly with texts and emails, some encouraging, others hostile. The vitriol spilled into comment sections. "Another outsider who thinks he knows better. Stay in your lane, Doc. This is none of your business." The more Malcolm read, the more his resolve hardened. He had opened Pandora's box, and there was no closing it now. By mid-afternoon, Malcolm decided to return to Cedartown. His lecture at the hospital conference had been well received, but he couldn't shake the sense that he needed to face the situation head-on. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about challenging a system that thrived on intimidation and silence. He drove back into town, the familiarity of its quiet streets now tinged with unease. The diner where he'd first encountered Sheriff Hale came into view, and Malcolm felt a pang of apprehension. The town felt smaller now, its insularity more suffocating. He parked his car near the library and made his way toward a small park where a community meeting was being held. A modest crowd had gathered, mostly locals, with a smattering of reporters and activists holding signs. As Malcolm approached, the energy in the crowd shifted. Whispers spread, and heads turned. People recognized him, not from his physical presence, but from the letter that had painted a target on his back. "Dr. St. James," a woman called out, hurrying toward him. She introduced herself as Linda, a local teacher, and one of the organizers of the meeting. "I can't believe you came. Thank you for what you wrote. It was brave." Malcolm nodded, offering a polite smile. "Thank you, this is something that needed to be said." Linda gestured toward the makeshift stage, where a few speakers were addressing the crowd. "Would you mind saying a few words? People need to hear from you directly." Malcolm hesitated. Public speaking was second nature to him, but this wasn't a lecture hall filled with peers. This was personal, raw. Still, he nodded, knowing the moment called for action. Standing on the stage, Malcolm took the microphone and surveyed the crowd. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of dozens of eyes on him. "My name is Dr. Malcolm St. James, and I'd like to share why I felt compelled to speak out." He recounted his experience with Sheriff Hale, not just the traffic stop, but the undercurrent of hostility he'd felt throughout his brief time in Cedartown. He tied it to broader issues, citing examples from his medical career where patients had suffered due to systemic inequities. This isn't just about one sheriff or one town, he concluded. This is about accountability, about ensuring that every person, regardless of their background, is treated with dignity and respect. The crowd erupted into applause, but not everyone was clapping. At the back of the park, a small group of uniformed officers stood watching. Among them was Sheriff Hale, his face a mask of restrained fury. Malcolm met his gaze and held it, refusing to look away. After the meeting, Malcolm lingered to speak with locals. Some shared stories of their own encounters with the sheriff's department, their voices trembling with frustration and fear. Others offered gratitude, thanking him for shedding light on an issue they'd felt powerless to confront. As the crowd began to thin, a young man approached Malcolm, his baseball cap pulled low. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder before speaking. "Dr. St. James?" "Yes," Malcolm said, noting the man's unease. "My name's Mitchell. I work at the station with Hale. Well, I used to. I quit last month," the man said, his voice low. "I read your letter. You're right about him, about all of it." Malcolm's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Mitchell glanced around again before stepping closer. "Hale's been running this town like his own little kingdom for years. The stops, the searches, the intimidation. It's all deliberate, and it's not just about race. He goes after anyone who challenges him. I've seen him plant evidence to make arrests stick. I've seen him threaten people into silence, and I think he's doing it again." "Doing what?" Malcolm asked, his voice calm but urgent. Mitchell hesitated, his face pale. "I think he's planning something to make you look bad. I overheard some of the guys talking about pulling you in for questioning. They said something about drugs." The weight of Mitchell's words hit Malcolm like a blow. He'd anticipated backlash, but this was more than personal retaliation. This was a calculated attempt to destroy his credibility. "Why are you telling me this?" Malcolm asked. Mitchell swallowed hard. "Because it's wrong and I'm tired of staying quiet." Malcolm placed a steady hand on Mitchell's shoulder. "Thank you. This took courage." Mitchell nodded, but the fear in his eyes remained. "Be careful. He's not the kind of man who likes to lose." Later that evening, Malcolm sat in his hotel room, replaying Mitchell's warning in his mind. He'd dealt with pressure before. Operating on failing hearts required composure under the most extreme conditions. But this was different. This wasn't just a matter of skill or precision. This was about survival. As he sipped a glass of water, his phone buzzed with a call. The number was unfamiliar, but he answered. "Dr. St. James?" a voice on the other end asked. "Yes. Who is this?" "This is Officer Daniels from the Cedartown Sheriff's Department. We need you to come down to the station to answer a few questions." Malcolm's heart sank, but his voice remained steady. "Questions about what?" "We've received a tip about illegal activity. It's routine, shouldn't take long." Malcolm tightened his grip on the phone. He knew exactly what this was. "I'll be there shortly." Hanging up, Malcolm took a moment to steady himself. He knew this wasn't going to be routine, not with Hale pulling the strings, but he wasn't going to back down. If they thought intimidation would silence him, they were sorely mistaken. At the station, Malcolm was greeted by two officers, their expressions blank, but their postures tense. They led him to a small interrogation room, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the gray walls. Sheriff Hale entered moments later, a self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face. He dropped a folder onto the table and sat opposite Malcolm, leaning back in his chair like a man who thought he'd already won. "Evening, Doc," Hale drawled. "Appreciate you coming in." "I didn't have much of a choice," Malcolm replied evenly. Hale chuckled. "Fair enough. We've had a report, a credible one, that you've been transporting illegal substances." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "That's a lie." "Maybe," Hale said with a shrug. "Maybe not, but we'll need to search your vehicle again. You know, to be thorough." Malcolm leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Hale's. "You can search whatever you like, you won't find anything. Because I don't have anything." Hale's smirk faltered, but only slightly. "We'll see." The door opened, and Officer Daniels entered, holding a small plastic bag. Inside was a suspicious white powder. "Found this in his trunk," Daniels announced, placing the bag on the table. Malcolm's stomach turned. He knew exactly what this was. Planted evidence. Hale's grin widened. "Well, well, looks like we've got a problem, Doc." Malcolm's mind raced, his surgeon's precision kicking in. This was the breaking point, the moment he'd been pushed too far. "I hope you know," Malcolm said, his voice calm but deadly serious, "that this isn't going to end the way you think it will." Hale leaned forward, his smirk taunting. "We'll see about that." The silence in the small interrogation room was deafening, as the bag of white powder sat between Malcolm and Sheriff Hale, its presence as damning as a gavel's fall. Malcolm's chest tightened, not from fear, but from the weight of the injustice bearing down on him. His pulse remained steady, his surgeon's discipline taking over. Every word, every reaction now mattered. Hale leaned back, his chair creaking slightly, as he folded his arms and grinned. "It's funny," he said, his tone dripping with mock pity. "A man like you, with all your fancy degrees and a nice car, still finds himself here? Guess you're not so different after all." Malcolm locked eyes with Hale, refusing to flinch. "You and I both know that bag wasn't in my car when I drove here." Hale feigned surprise, his eyebrows arching. "Are you accusing me of something, Doc? Careful now. False accusations can get you into even more trouble." Malcolm didn't respond. He knew this game. Any outburst would only feed into Hale's narrative, a script the sheriff was eager to weaponize against him. Instead, Malcolm took a deep breath, focusing on the facts and the steps ahead. The door opened, and Officer Daniels re-entered, clipboard in hand. His face was a mask of neutrality, but Malcolm caught a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Mitchell's words echoed in Malcolm's mind. "He's not the kind of man who likes to lose." "Sheriff?" Daniels began, his voice firm but low. "We've got the evidence. Should I proceed with processing?" Hale smirked, but Malcolm noticed how Daniels avoided direct eye contact with him. It was a crack, subtle but present. In the facade of control, Malcolm saw an opportunity. "Officer Daniels," Malcolm said, his tone calm but commanding. "You've worked under Sheriff Hale for years. Do you really believe that bag belongs to me?" Daniels stiffened, his hand tightening around the clipboard. "I'm just following procedure." "Procedure," Malcolm repeated, leaning forward slightly. "And if that procedure is corrupt, if you know this evidence has been planted, are you willing to destroy a man's life to protect it?" Daniels didn't respond, but his jaw clenched. Malcolm pressed on. "You took an oath to serve and protect, not to cover for abuse of power, not to silence the truth. If you follow this through, you'll be complicit." Hale's grin faltered for the first time. "Daniels," he barked, his voice sharp. "You're not paid to debate, do your job." Daniels hesitated, his internal conflict written all over his face. For a moment, the tension in the room felt like a coiled spring, ready to snap. The door swung open again, and Mitchell entered, his face pale but resolute. His sudden appearance seemed to catch both Hale and Daniels off guard. "Sheriff?" Mitchell said, his voice trembling slightly, but growing steadier with each word. "We need to talk." Hale scowled, irritation flashing across his face. "This is a closed interrogation, get out." But Mitchell didn't budge. Instead, he stepped further into the room, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I can't stay quiet anymore. Not about this." Hale stood, his imposing frame towering over Mitchell, but the younger man held his ground. "You're making a mistake, son," Hale growled. "Get out before you regret it." "No," Mitchell said, his voice rising. "I've regretted staying silent for too long. I know what you're doing to Dr. St. James. I know what you've done to others, and I won't be part of it anymore." Malcolm felt a surge of hope, tempered by the reality of how dangerous this moment was, for both him and Mitchell. Hale's expression darkened, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "Think carefully about your next words, Mitchell." But Mitchell squared his shoulders, his fear giving way to defiance. The bag was planted. "Just like the other times. You think you're untouchable, but you're not. I've seen enough, and I'm not going to let you ruin another innocent person's life." The room fell into a tense silence. Hale's face reddened with fury. and Malcolm could see the struggle in Daniel's posture as he shifted uncomfortably, caught between loyalty and conscience. Malcolm seized the moment. "Sheriff Hale, it's over," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "You can intimidate your deputies, you can try to silence me, but the truth is already out there. My letter, my story. It's exposed you to the world people are watching." Hale slammed a hand down on the table, the sound reverberating through the room. "You think a bunch of headlines and hashtags scare me? I run this town." "Not for long," Malcolm said, his tone icy. "Because now, people like Mitchell are standing up, and for every Mitchell, there are a dozen more ready to speak out. You've built your power on fear, but fear is a fragile foundation." Hale's sneer wavered, his bravado cracking just enough for Malcolm to see the uncertainty underneath. The sheriff turned to Daniels, his voice a barked command. "Take him in now." Daniels didn't move. His hand gripped the clipboard tighter, his knuckles white, but he didn't follow Hale's order. "Daniels!" Hale shouted, his tone desperate. "I said take him in." Daniels looked at Mitchell, then at Malcolm. Finally, he spoke, his voice trembling but resolute. "I can't do it." Hale's face twisted in rage. "You're throwing your career away, Daniels?" "For what him?" "For what's right," Daniels said, his voice gaining strength. He placed the clipboard on the table and stepped back. "I won't be part of this." Before Hale could react, the sound of raised voices echoed from the hallway outside. Malcolm caught snippets of words. Reporters, evidence, internal affairs. The tension in the room shifted as the door opened once again, this time revealing Linda and a small group of journalists, cameras in hand. Behind them were two sharply dressed men wearing badges, identifying them as state investigators. "Sheriff Hale," one of the investigators said, his tone clipped. "We need to speak with you now." Hale's confidence evaporated as the reality of the situation hit him. The reporters were already filming, their cameras capturing every detail of the scene. Hale's face darkened, and for a moment, Malcolm thought he might lash out. But then the sheriff stepped back, his fists clenched, and stormed out of the room. The investigators followed, leaving Malcolm, Mitchell, and Daniels alone in the room. The adrenaline coursing through Malcolm's veins began to subside, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He turned to Mitchell, offering a small, grateful nod. "Thank you, that took courage." Mitchell looked down, his shoulders sagging. "I should have spoken up sooner." "You spoke up when it mattered," Malcolm said. "That's what counts." Daniels cleared his throat, his face pale but resolute. "Dr. St. James, I'm sorry for everything." Malcolm studied the officer for a moment, then nodded. "It's not me you need to apologize to. It's the countless others who didn't have someone to fight for them." Daniels looked away, shame clouding his expression. As Malcolm stepped out of the station into the cool night air, the weight of the day pressed down on him. The reporters swarmed, shouting questions, their cameras flashing. But Malcolm ignored them, his focus on the path ahead. This battle wasn't over, not for him, and certainly not for the town of Cedartown. As he walked to his car, Mitchell jogged up beside him. "Dr. St. James," he said, his voice earnest, "what happens now?" Malcolm paused, looking out at the small insular town that had tried to break him. "Now," he said, "we keep fighting, not just against men like Hale, but against the system that enables them. This is only the beginning." He got into his car and started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness. In the rear-view mirror, he saw Mitchell standing on the sidewalk, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Malcolm drove away, his mind racing with plans for what came next. This wasn't just a fight for Cedartown, this was a fight for justice everywhere, and he wasn't going to stop until the cracks in the system became impossible to ignore. Malcolm parked his car just outside the Cedartown Community Center, where a town hall meeting had been hastily organized, following the public outcry sparked by his letter. The atmosphere outside was electric, both with anticipation and tension. Activists holding signs chanted for justice, their voices blending with the hum of reporters' questions and the muttered conversations of locals. Malcolm stepped out, his presence commanding attention, despite his calm demeanor. The crowd quieted momentarily, eyes turning to him. He adjusted his blazer, squared his shoulders, and walked through the throng, nodding politely to those who offered him encouragement. He knew this was no ordinary meeting. This was the battleground where he'd face Sheriff Hale for the first time since the debacle at the station. Inside, the community center was packed. Rows of folding chairs filled the room, with standing room at the back. On the far side of the room, a panel of local officials sat at a long table draped with a cheap blue cloth. Hale sat among them, his posture rigid, his face a mask of restrained fury. Next to him was Mayor Thompson, an older man with a perpetual scowl, who was clearly eager to contain the chaos. Malcolm took a seat near the front, flanked by Linda and Mitchell. Mitchell's nervous energy was palpable, but Malcolm placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Stay steady," he whispered. "The truth will speak for itself." The mayor stood and banged a gavel, calling the meeting to order. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice tired, "we're here to address concerns raised about the conduct of the Cedartown Sheriff's Department. I urge everyone to remain civil." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. The mayor cleared his throat. "Before we open the floor for public comment, Sheriff Hale has requested an opportunity to respond to the allegations made against him." Hale rose slowly, his imposing figure towering over the seated panel. His expression was one of practiced composure, but Malcolm saw the barely concealed anger in his eyes. Hale adjusted the microphone, his voice steady, but cold. "I'd like to start by saying that these allegations are baseless," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Dr. St. James is an outsider who doesn't understand how things work in Cedartown. My department enforces the law fairly and without prejudice. Any suggestion otherwise is an insult to the hard-working men and women who put their lives on the line every day." A smattering of applause came from a small section of the room, but the majority of the crowd remained silent, their expressions skeptical. Hale continued, leaning into the microphone. "It's easy to point fingers when you don't have the full picture, but I stand by my record, and I will not allow my reputation, or this town's reputation, to be tarnished by unfounded accusations." Hale's eyes flicked briefly to Malcolm, the challenge clear. Malcolm met his gaze without flinching, his silence louder than any rebuttal. The mayor gestured toward the audience. "Dr. St. James, would you like to respond?" Malcolm rose smoothly, his every movement deliberate. The room seemed to hold its breath as he approached the microphone. He glanced at Hale before addressing the crowd. "Sheriff Hale says I don't understand how things work in Cedartown," Malcolm began, his voice measured but firm. "He's right. I don't understand why a man in his position feels entitled to abuse his power. I don't understand why the people sworn to protect this community are the ones instilling fear in it." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, growing louder. Malcolm continued, his tone sharpening. "This isn't about me. It's about the countless voices that have been silenced. It's about the people who've been intimidated, humiliated, and even falsely accused because they dared to exist in a system that views them as less than." He gestured toward Mitchell, who shifted uncomfortably but nodded in solidarity. "And some of those voices are here tonight, ready to tell the truth." Hale shot to his feet, slamming a hand on the table. "This is a circus," he barked, his composure finally cracking. "You think you can waltz in here with your fancy words and turn this town against me? I've been serving Cedartown for 20 years?" Malcolm turned to face him fully, his expression calm but unyielding. "And in those 20 years, how many lives have you destroyed to protect your own interests?" The room erupted into chaos. Some cheered, others shouted in protest. The mayor banged his gavel furiously, demanding order. Hale leaned forward, his face inches from the microphone. "You don't know a damn thing about me, St. James," he snarled. "You think you're better because you've got a title and a fancy car. You don't belong here and you never will." The venom in Hale's words silenced the room, the weight of his prejudice laid bare for all to see. Malcolm took a step closer to the table, his voice low but carrying. "That's where you're wrong, Sheriff. I belong anywhere I choose to be, and tonight, I'm here to make sure you answer for your actions." As the tension reached its peak, the door at the back of the room opened. Two men in suits entered, their presence commanding attention. The crowd turned to watch as they approached the panel, flashing badges that identified them as state investigators. "Sheriff Hale," one of them said, his voice cutting through the silence, "we need to speak with you." Hale's face twisted in confusion and anger. What is this? The investigator held up a file. We've received evidence corroborating allegations of misconduct within your department, including witness testimony and documented instances of falsified reports. We're here to take you into custody. The room erupted again, this time with gasps and murmurs of shock. Hale stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is a setup, it's him. He jabbed a finger at Malcolm. He's behind this. Malcolm didn't respond, his gaze steady as Hale's world began to unravel. The investigators approached Hale, their movements calm but firm. Sheriff Hale, you're under arrest for abuse of power, falsifying evidence, and obstruction of justice. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back. Hale's face turned red, his body trembling with barely restrained rage. For a moment, it looked like he might resist. But the weight of the evidence, and the eyes of the crowd, left him no choice. Slowly, reluctantly, he complied, his hands bound in cuffs as the investigators led him away. The room buzzed with a mix of disbelief and vindication. Malcolm returned to his seat, his heart pounding. Linda leaned over, her voice hushed. You did it. No, Malcolm said quietly. We did it. As the meeting adjourned, reporters swarmed Malcolm, their questions rapid fire. But he didn't stop for interviews. He had said everything he needed to say, and the rest was in the hands of the community. Outside, Mitchell caught up with him. Dr. St. James, he said, his voice filled with awe. I don't know how you stayed so calm in there. Malcolm offered a small smile. When you've held a human heart in your hands, it puts things into perspective. Mitchell chuckled, but his expression grew serious. You've changed things here for the first time. It feels like we might have a chance. Malcolm nodded, placing a hand on Mitchell's shoulder. The work's just beginning, but tonight, we took a step forward. As he walked to his car, the weight of the night settled over him. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, he felt the tide turning. Hale was gone, and the community had found its voice. Malcolm stood in the Cedartown courthouse, a building whose worn marble floors and peeling walls seemed to echo the weight of decades of unchallenged authority. The room buzzed with murmurs and the clicking of reporters' cameras. Outside, protesters chanted for justice, their voices filtering faintly through the thick walls. But inside, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Malcolm, dressed sharply in a charcoal suit, stood tall at the defense table, his hands resting lightly on its surface. Across from him sat Sheriff Hale, his face a storm cloud of barely restrained fury. This wasn't the way Malcolm had planned for the truth to come out. After the planted evidence, and Hale's attempts to intimidate him into submission, Malcolm had filed a formal complaint with the state, presenting his experience and the testimonies of allies like Mitchell. The state investigators had acted quickly, but the sheriff's department, with its deep ties to Cedartown's power structure, wasn't going down without a fight. Hale had pushed for a hearing, painting himself as the victim of an outsider's vendetta. And now, here they were, both of them staring each other down in the courthouse, with the whole town watching. The judge, a middle-aged man with a firm but weary demeanor, entered the room and called the session to order. The murmurs subsided, and Malcolm straightened his posture. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for the many voices that had been silenced in this town. The hearing began with Hale's lawyer presenting his defense. It was a predictable playbook: dismiss Malcolm's claims as baseless, discredit the witnesses who had come forward, and cast Hale as a misunderstood leader trying to maintain order in a difficult town. Sheriff Hale has served this community for over 2 decades, the lawyer intoned, pacing in front of the panel. He has dedicated his life to upholding the law. These accusations are not just an attack on him, they're an attack on the very fabric of Cedartown. Malcolm remained composed, his hands clasped in front of him. He'd heard this kind of rhetoric before. It was designed to appeal to fear and nostalgia, not truth. When it was Malcolm's turn to speak, he rose calmly and approached the podium. He could feel every eye in the room on him, some filled with skepticism, others with hope. Your Honor, members of the court, he began, his voice steady. I didn't come to Cedartown looking for a fight. I came for a brief visit and found myself facing a system that seemed determined to silence me. This isn't about me being an outsider, it's about a pattern of abuse that has gone unchecked for too long. He recounted the traffic stop, the planted evidence, and the harassment he'd endured, but he didn't stop there. He brought up Mitchell's testimony and highlighted other cases he'd uncovered, stories of locals who had been unfairly targeted, intimidated, and punished for challenging Hale's authority. "This is not law enforcement," Malcolm said, his voice rising slightly. "This is oppression disguised as order." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. Hale's lawyer stood, his expression smug. "Dr. St. James," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "You've painted a compelling story, but isn't it true that you have no direct evidence linking Sheriff Hale to these alleged acts of misconduct? Isn't it possible that you're simply mistaken?" Malcolm was ready for this. "I do have evidence," he said calmly. He gestured toward the door, and the state investigators entered, carrying a stack of files and a laptop. The lead investigator approached the bench and handed the judge a sealed envelope. "These are records obtained during our investigation of the Cedartown Sheriff's Department," the investigator explained. "They include text messages, emails, and surveillance footage that corroborate Dr. St. James's claims." The judge opened the envelope and scanned its contents, his expression darkening. He handed it to the clerk, who projected the documents onto a screen for the courtroom to see. The room gasped as the first message appeared. A text exchange between Hale and one of his deputies, discussing plans to plant drugs during a traffic stop. The messages were damning, filled with casual references to falsifying reports and intimidating troublemakers. "This is absurd," Hale bellowed, rising to his feet. "These messages are fake. This is a setup." But the evidence kept coming. Emails instructing deputies to target specific individuals, surveillance footage showing suspicious activity during traffic stops, and even a recording of Hale bragging about his ability to keep people in line. Hale's face turned ashen as the weight of the evidence bore down on him. His lawyer fumbled for words, but it was clear the narrative they'd tried to construct had unraveled. As the revelations mounted, Hale's anger boiled over. He stood abruptly, pointing a trembling finger at Malcolm. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" he snarled. "You come into my town, stirring up trouble, turning people against me. You don't know what it takes to run a place like this." Malcolm stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "What it takes is integrity. Sheriff leadership isn't about fear, it's about trust, and you've betrayed the trust of this community." "You don't belong here," Hale shouted, his composure shattered. "People like you think you can waltz in and take over, but this town doesn't need you." The words hung in the air, their prejudice undeniable. The judge banged his gavel. "Sheriff Hale, control yourself, or I'll have you removed from this courtroom." Hale sat down, his face a mask of fury, but the damage was done. His true nature had been exposed, not just in words, but in actions. As the hearing concluded, the judge addressed the room. "Based on the evidence presented today, it is clear that there has been a gross abuse of power within the Cedartown Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Hale, you are hereby suspended from duty pending further investigation, and I am recommending that charges be filed against you." The room erupted into a mix of cheers and murmurs. Hale sat frozen, his face pale, and his hands gripping the edge of the table. Malcolm exhaled slowly, the tension that had gripped him for weeks finally beginning to release. But even as the gavel struck, signaling the end of the hearing, Malcolm knew the fight wasn't over. Hale's allies still held power in Cedartown, and systemic change wouldn't come easily. This was just the first battle in a much larger war. As Malcolm stepped outside into the bright afternoon sun, he was met by a wave of reporters and supporters. Linda and Mitchell stood nearby, their faces lit with cautious optimism. "You did it," Linda said, her voice filled with emotion. "We did it," Malcolm replied. But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease Hale's words echoed in his mind. "This town doesn't need you." He turned to Mitchell. "Keep your guard up. People like Hale don't go down without a fight." Mitchell nodded, his expression serious. "What about you? Are you staying?" Malcolm hesitated, looking out at the crowd. The chants of the protesters mingled with the hum of reporters' questions, creating a cacophony that seemed to capture the chaotic energy of the moment. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "But one thing's certain. This town deserves better, and I'll do everything I can to help make that happen." As he walked to his car, Malcolm's mind raced with possibilities. He had taken a stand and exposed the truth. But the road ahead was still uncertain. Would Cedartown embrace change, or would it cling to the status quo? Would justice prevail, or would Hale and his allies find a way to regain their power? The answers weren't clear, but Malcolm knew one thing. The fight for justice was far from over. The Cedartown courthouse was almost empty, as the final signatures were added to the documents, formalizing Sheriff Hale's suspension. Outside, the afternoon light bathed the town in a soft glow, as if the weight of the day's events had begun to lift. Malcolm stood by the steps, gazing at the crowd of protesters, reporters and locals who had gathered throughout the day. Their faces reflected a range of emotions: relief, exhaustion, and cautious optimism. Hale had been escorted out of the building under the watchful eyes of state investigators, his defiant glare doing little to mask the cracks in his bravado. The evidence presented in court had been damning, and with the judge recommending criminal charges, his reign over Cedartown had effectively ended. But Malcolm knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a much larger fight. As Malcolm descended the courthouse steps, Linda and Mitchell hurried to meet him. Linda was visibly emotional, her voice trembling as she spoke. "You did it, Dr. St. James. For the first time in years, it feels like justice is actually possible here." Malcolm offered her a small smile. "We did it," he corrected. "None of this would have been possible without people like you and Mitchell stepping forward." Mitchell, who had remained silent for most of the hearing, looked up. There was a new steadiness in his voice when he said, "You gave us the courage to speak up. I've spent so much time feeling powerless, but today was different." Malcolm nodded, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "The truth always finds a way, even when the odds seem impossible. Now it's up to all of us to make sure this momentum doesn't stop here." From the corner of his eye, Malcolm noticed a small group of locals whispering to one another as they approached. One of them, an older man with weathered hands and a solemn expression, stepped forward. "You don't know me, Dr. St. James," he began, his voice heavy with emotion, "but I've lived in this town my whole life. What you did today. I didn't think anyone would ever stand up to Hale like that. Thank you." Malcolm shook the man's hand, humbled by the gesture. "It's not just about standing up to one man," he said. "It's about changing the system that allowed him to thrive in the first place." Later that evening, Malcolm found himself back in his hotel room, the adrenaline from the day finally wearing off. He sat by the window, staring out at the quiet streets of Cedartown. His mind replayed the events of the past weeks, the harassment, the threats, and the final confrontation. It had been one of the hardest battles of his life, but also one of the most important. For years, Malcolm had believed that his work as a surgeon was his greatest contribution to the world. Every life he saved in the operating room had been a victory, a testament to his skill and determination. But Cedartown had shown him another side of his purpose, a calling to confront injustices beyond the sterile walls of a hospital. He had always known the weight of his identity as a black man in a system designed to marginalize him. But this experience had deepened his resolve. The fight wasn't just about his personal survival. It was about paving the way for others who didn't have his resources or platform. The days following the hearing brought a flurry of activity. The state investigators expanded their probe into the sheriff's department, uncovering decades of misconduct that went far beyond Hale's personal actions. Deputies who had enabled his abuses were suspended, and plans for a complete overhaul of the department were announced. The Cedartown Gazette, which had once been reluctant to challenge local authority, published a scathing exposé detailing the corruption and its impact on the community. Activists organized town halls to ensure that the voices of those most affected would shape the reforms to come. One of the most poignant moments came when Linda invited Malcolm to speak at a community gathering. The room was packed with locals, many of whom had spent years living in fear of Hale's authority. Malcolm stood before them, his voice steady but impassioned. "This isn't the end of the fight," he said. "Real change takes time, it takes persistence, but today, you've shown that even the most entrenched systems can be challenged. Don't let anyone tell you that your voice doesn't matter." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers carrying a sense of hope that had been absent from the town for far too long. That night, Malcolm returned to the diner where it had all begun. The same waitress who had served him on his first visit greeted him with a warm smile, her demeanor noticeably lighter. "You've shaken things up around here," she said, as she poured him a cup of coffee. I didn't think anyone could take Hale down, but you proved me wrong. Malcolm chuckled softly. It wasn't just me. The waitress leaned on the counter, her expression thoughtful. Still, it takes someone special to stand up to a man like that. This town owes you. Malcolm sipped his coffee, the weight of her words sinking in. He didn't need the town's gratitude, but knowing that his actions had made a difference filled him with a quiet sense of fulfillment. As Malcolm prepared to leave Cedartown the following morning, he received a call from a journalist who had been covering the story. She wanted to discuss the broader implications of the case and the lessons it held for other communities facing similar challenges. We need voices like yours, Dr. St. James, she said. Have you considered doing more advocacy work? Malcolm hesitated. The thought of balancing his medical career with a broader role in social justice was daunting, but he couldn't ignore the impact he had already made. I'll think about it, he replied, the wheels in his mind already turning. Before leaving town, Malcolm stopped by Mitchell's modest apartment. The young man had been instrumental in exposing Hale, and Malcolm wanted to thank him personally. You've got a future ahead of you, Mitchell, Malcolm said, as they shook hands. Don't let fear hold you back. Mitchell nodded, his expression determined. I won't. And if you ever need backup in the future, you know where to find me. As Malcolm drove away from Cedartown, he felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. The battle with Hale had been won, but the war against systemic injustice was far from over. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he also knew he wasn't alone. Cedartown had shown him the power of collective action, and he was ready to carry that lesson forward. The town faded in his rearview mirror, but its people, and their resilience, stayed with him. As he merged onto the highway, his phone buzzed with a new message, a request to speak at a national conference on criminal justice reform. Malcolm smiled to himself, the seed of a new purpose taking root. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt ready to embrace it fully. The road stretched ahead of Malcolm St. James as he drove away from Cedartown, its winding curves disappearing into the horizon. In the quiet hum of his car, he allowed himself to exhale fully for the first time in weeks. The weight of the struggle, the moments of doubt, and the anger that had burned so fiercely within him now seemed to settle, replaced by a profound sense of clarity. Cedartown had tested Malcolm in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had entered the town as a visitor, someone simply passing through. But what began as a momentary encounter with injustice had transformed into something far greater. A confrontation, not just with one man's abuse of power, but with a system that had allowed that abuse to thrive. And in standing his ground, Malcolm had changed, not just his perspective, but the trajectory of his life. For years, Malcolm's life had revolved around precision. In the operating room, where every second mattered, he found control in his skill and focus. Success was measured in lives saved, in the quiet gratitude of patients who walked out of his hospital with a second chance. But Cedartown had reminded him that not every battle could be fought in a sterile, controlled environment. Some battles demanded stepping into the unknown, risking one's own safety and reputation for the sake of a larger truth. Malcolm had always prided himself on his resilience, but this experience had taught him the importance of vulnerability. It wasn't easy to admit fear or anger, especially when the stakes were so high. Yet in doing so, he discovered a strength that went beyond his professional discipline, a strength rooted in purpose. Now, as he looked back on the events in Cedartown, he understood that his fight wasn't just about dismantling one man's grip on power. It was about paving the way for others, ensuring that the voices of those who had been silenced would finally be heard. The story of Cedartown was not unique. Small towns and big cities alike were filled with institutions that thrived on fear and silence, where power was hoarded by a few at the expense of the many. Sheriff Hale was a product of such a system, a man emboldened by unchecked authority and the complicity of those around him. His downfall was a victory, but it was also a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained these problems were. Malcolm thought of the people he'd met during his time in Cedartown, Linda, whose quiet strength had kept the community's hope alive even in the darkest moments. Mitchell, who had risked everything to stand up against a man who had controlled his life for so long, and the countless others, shopkeepers, laborers, teachers, who had shared their stories of fear and frustration, finding courage in one another. Their bravery was the heart of the change taking place in Cedartown. It wasn't Malcolm's presence alone that had shifted the tide. It was the collective determination of a community that had decided enough was enough. Still, Malcolm knew the fight was far from over. Hale might have been removed from power, but the structures that had enabled him remained. Rebuilding trust in Cedartown would take time, effort, and vigilance. And yet, for the first time in years, there was hope. A glimmer of possibility that the town could become a place where justice truly prevailed. Malcolm's thoughts turned to the larger world beyond Cedartown. His letter to the Gazette had sparked a conversation that reached far beyond the town's borders. Messages flooded his inbox from people across the country, some sharing similar experiences, others expressing their gratitude for his courage. Activists and organizations reached out, inviting him to join broader efforts to combat systemic racism and abuse of power. The outpouring of support was humbling, but it also came with a sobering realization. The issues Cedartown faced were mirrored in countless other places. For every Hale brought to justice, there were others whose actions went unchecked. For every Mitchell who spoke out, there were dozens more who remained too afraid to do so. Yet Malcolm refused to let the enormity of the challenge overwhelm him. Cedartown had shown him what was possible when people came together, when courage and truth became the guiding forces of change. The battle wasn't just for lawyers or activists, it was for everyone. The teacher who taught her students to question authority, the journalist who risked backlash to expose the truth, the everyday citizen who chose to listen, to learn, and to act. We all have a role to play, Malcolm had told the crowd at the community gathering. The fight for justice isn't a sprint, it's a marathon, and every step we take brings us closer to the finish line. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, Malcolm pulled his car to the side of the road. He stepped out and leaned against the hood, taking in the expanse of farmland stretching endlessly before him. The air was quiet, save for the occasional chirp of crickets. In this moment of stillness, he allowed himself to reflect fully on the journey. He thought of the look on Hale's face as the evidence had been laid bare in court. The moment when arrogance turned to desperation, when power slipped through his grasp. He thought of Linda's tearful embrace after the hearing, her whispered words of gratitude. He thought of Mitchell's quiet determination, the spark of hope in his eyes as he realized that change was truly possible. But most of all, Malcolm thought of his own transformation. Cedartown had forced him to confront not just the world's injustices, but his own fears and doubts. It had tested his patience, his resilience, and his faith in humanity. And while the scars of that struggle would remain, so too would the lessons it had taught him. As he stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Malcolm felt an overwhelming sense of resolve. This wasn't the end of his journey, it was the beginning of something far greater. The fight for justice was a marathon, and he was ready to keep running. Malcolm returned to his car and resumed his drive, his mind already racing with plans for the future. He had agreed to speak at the National Conference on Criminal Justice Reform, where he would share his story and advocate for systemic change. He also planned to work with grassroots organizations, using his platform to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. As the miles stretched out before him, Malcolm's phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Linda, accompanied by a photo of a town hall meeting packed with people. The caption read, "We're keeping the fight alive. Thank you for lighting the spark." Malcolm smiled, his heart swelling with pride. Cedartown's fight was far from over, but its people were ready to carry the torch. The road ahead was long, uncertain, and filled with challenges. But as Malcolm drove into the night, his headlights cutting through the darkness, he felt a profound sense of purpose. The unspoken truths he had fought to expose were no longer silent. They were a call to action, a reminder that, together, change was possible. And with that, Malcolm pressed onward, ready to face whatever came next.